The security alarm shrieked through the empty corridors of the Meridian Tower at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the silence like a blade. Raizo Martinez dropped his mop and ran toward the sound, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floors he'd spent hours cleaning. 23 floors up in Denver's most prestigious office building. He'd heard everything from late-night arguments to celebration parties, but never children crying. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He found them huddled behind the reception desk on the 15th floor, two small figures clutching each other in the darkness. A boy and a girl, maybe 6 years old, their faces streaked with tears and their expensive clothes wrinkled from hours of hiding. The girl had chocolate brown hair tangled around her shoulders, while the boy's sandy locks stuck up at odd angles. They looked up at Raizo with wide, terrified eyes that reminded him painfully of his own son Danny when he'd had nightmares. The moment Raizo saw those frightened children, everything else ceased to matter. His shift ended in 20 minutes, and he had to pick up Danny from his neighbor Mrs. Patterson's apartment by midnight, or pay an extra fee he couldn't afford. His son would be waiting, probably already in his dinosaur pajamas, ready for their late-night routine of reading 3 pages from whatever library book they'd borrowed that week. But looking at these lost twins, Raizo knew he couldn't walk away. He knelt down slowly, the way he'd learned to approach Danny when he was scared, making himself smaller and less threatening. The children pressed closer together, and Raizo noticed the girl was protecting her brother, one small arm wrapped around his shoulders, in a gesture that spoke of fierce loyalty despite her own fear. "Hey there," Raizo said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he used when Danny woke from bad dreams. "I'm Raizo. I work here at night, making sure everything stays safe and clean. You guys look like you might be lost?" The girl nodded reluctantly, her chin trembling as she tried to be brave. "We can't find Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming of the building's ventilation system. "She was supposed to meet us after her big meeting, but she never came." Raizo's heart clenched. He thought of all the times Danny had waited for him at school pickup, scanning the crowd of parents until he spotted his father's familiar face. The relief in a child's eyes when they found their person was something sacred, and these kids had been denied that comfort for hours. "What are your names?" Raizo asked, settling cross-legged on the floor to show them he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm Maya," the girl said, her protective arm tightening around her brother. "This is Lucas. We're twins, but I'm 7 minutes older, so I take care of him." Lucas nodded solemnly, clearly content to let his sister speak for both of them. Raizo noticed the boy's expensive shoes were untied, and without thinking he reached forward slowly, giving them time to pull away if they wanted. When they didn't move, he gently tied Lucas's shoelaces, remembering how Danny used to trip constantly before he learned to manage his own shoes. "Well, Maya and Lucas, I'm going to help you find your mommy," Raizo said with quiet confidence. "But first, are you hungry? I've got some crackers in my supply cart, and there's a vending machine down the hall." The twins exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them before Maya nodded. As Raizo led them to his janitor's cart, he wondered what kind of mother worked so late that her children ended up wandering a corporate building after midnight. Part of him felt angry at the negligence, but a larger part recognized the desperation he saw in families everywhere. Parents working impossible hours just to survive, caught between providing for their children and being present for them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He gave the twins his emergency snacks, saltine crackers, and a shared bottle of water, watching as they ate with the careful politeness of children who'd been taught good manners. Maya made sure Lucas got half of everything, and Lucas saved the last bite of his cracker for his sister. Their care for each other reminded Raizo of the bond he and his younger brother had shared before life pulled them in different directions. While the children ate, Raizo used his master key to access the building directory, searching for anyone who might be working this late. Most offices were dark, their employees long gone to suburban homes and family dinners. But the executive floor showed lights still burning, and Raizo remembered the sleek black sedan he'd seen in the parking garage, the one that didn't belong to any of the night shift workers. The decision forming in his mind would cost him Calling security would mean paperwork, questions, and delays that would make him late picking up Danny. Taking the children upstairs to look for their mother meant abandoning his post during work hours, something that could get him fired from the only steady job he'd managed to find since Sophie died. But as he looked at Maya's exhausted face and Lucas's trusting eyes, Raizo knew there was really no choice at all. Some things mattered more than following rules, more than protecting yourself from consequences. These children needed help, and he was the only one here to give it. Just like the night Sophie had collapsed, and he'd broken every traffic law getting her to the hospital. Just like the day he'd quit his engineering job to stay home with newborn Danny. When the daycare said they couldn't handle a colicky baby, some moments demanded you choose love over logic. Raizo made his choice. He was going to find their mother no matter what it cost him. The elevator hummed quietly as Raizo stood between Maya and Lucas, their small hands finding his calloused fingers as they rose toward the executive floors. He studied their reflection in the polished steel doors and saw three people who didn't belong in this gleaming tower of corporate power. His uniform was clean but faded from countless washes, his work boots scuffed from years of hard labor, while the twins wore clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Yet here they were, connected by circumstance and his inability to walk away from children in need. 2 years ago, Raizo had been a different man entirely. He'd worn pressed shirts and carried a briefcase to his job as a structural engineer at Morrison & Associates, one of Denver's most respected architecture firms. His office had overlooked the Rockies on clear days, and he'd spent his mornings designing bridges and buildings that would stand for generations. Sophie used to joke that he built things to last because he believed in permanence, in creating something solid in a world that felt increasingly fragile. Sophie Martinez had been a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, the kind of woman who could calm a screaming toddler with nothing but her voice and gentle hands. She'd worked night shifts so she could be home with Danny during the day, their schedules perfectly synchronized like a dance they'd perfected over 7 years of marriage. Raizo would leave for work as Sophie returned from the hospital, and they'd meet in the kitchen for 5 minutes of stolen conversation over coffee and shared exhaustion. Their life hadn't been luxurious, but it had been rich in the ways that mattered. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where Sophie would buy too many vegetables and Danny would beg for kettle corn. Sunday afternoons in City Park, where Raizo taught his son to throw a baseball, watching Sophie spread blankets under trees and read novels she never had time to finish during the week. They'd been saving for a house with a real yard, planning family vacations they'd never taken, talking about giving Danny a little brother or sister once they could afford the daycare costs. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in March. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, already spread beyond what surgery could reach. Sophie had been tired for months, but they'd blamed it on her work schedule, on the demands of caring for sick children 12 hours at a time. She'd even joked about getting old at 32, complaining that she couldn't keep up with Danny's energy the way she used to. By the time they found the tumor, it was already too late for optimism. The 18 months that followed had destroyed everything Raizo thought he knew about life's fairness. Sophie fought with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, enduring chemotherapy that left her too weak to stand while still trying to read bedtime stories to Danny from her hospital bed. Raizo had used all his sick leave, then all his vacation time, then taken unpaid leave to be with her during treatments. His boss had been understanding at first, but understanding only stretched so far when projects needed completion and clients demanded answers. The medical bills had started arriving before Sophie's hair grew back from the first round of chemo. Insurance covered the basics, but basics didn't include the experimental treatments they'd tried in desperation, the naturopathic supplements Sophie wanted to attempt, the private nurses who could help when Raizo had to work, and Danny needed someone to pick him up from school. Credit cards maxed out, retirement savings depleted, and still the treatments continued because giving up wasn't an option as long as Sophie kept fighting. When she died on a snow-covered morning in January, Raizo had been holding her hand while Danny slept curled against her side. Her last words had been instructions about their son's bedtime routine, reminders about the special way he liked his sandwiches cut, warnings about his fear of thunderstorms. Even dying, Sophie had been taking care of everyone else first. The funeral expenses had been the final blow to their finances. Raizo had wanted to give Sophie the beautiful service she deserved, the kind of goodbye that honored her kindness and celebrated her life. He'd chosen the expensive casket, the elaborate flower arrangements, the reception where all her co-workers could share stories about the children she'd saved and the families she'd comforted. Only after the bills arrived did he realize he'd spent money he didn't have on a day that Sophie, practical to the end, would have told him was unnecessary. Morrison and Associates had held his position for as long as they could. But grief didn't follow corporate timelines. Raizo couldn't concentrate on blueprints when everything reminded him of building the life he'd lost. He'd make mistakes in calculations, zone out during client meetings, miss deadlines, because keeping track of time felt impossible when time had taken everything that mattered. His supervisor had been gentle but firm when they let him go. "Take time to heal," she'd said, "but we need someone who can be fully present." The apartment in Stapleton was all Raizo could afford after selling their house to pay medical debts. 2 bedrooms in a complex where the heat worked sporadically and the neighbors' music played too loud on weekends. Danny had his own room, which was all that mattered, but Raizo slept on a pull-out couch in the living room and cooked on a hot plate because the stove had never been properly fixed. It was temporary, he told himself and Danny, just until he found steady work again, just until they got back on their feet. But getting back on his feet proved harder than he'd anticipated. Engineering positions required references, and explaining why he'd been fired for poor performance during his wife's terminal illness wasn't exactly a selling point. His former colleagues were sympathetic but cautious, unwilling to recommend someone whose grief might affect their own professional reputations. Months of interviews led nowhere, and his savings dwindled until he had to choose between pride and survival. The janitorial position at Meridian Tower had been a last resort, found through a temporary agency that didn't ask questions about his engineering degree or his previous salary. Night shifts paid slightly better, and it meant he could be home when Danny got out of school, help with homework, and maintain some semblance of the bedtime routine Sophie had insisted was crucial for their son's stability. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life they had, and he was determined to make it work. Danny, now 8 years old, had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience children possessed but shouldn't have to use. He never complained about the smaller apartment, or the fact that his father wore a uniform to work instead of business suits. He'd learned to be quiet during the day while Raizo slept, entertaining himself with library books and educational programs on their old tablet. In the evenings, they'd cook simple meals together, Danny standing on a step stool to reach the counter, chattering about his day while Raizo tried to forget his own. The hardest moments came when Danny asked questions Raizo couldn't answer. Why did Mommy have to die when she helped so many other people get better? Why couldn't they afford the house with a big backyard anymore? When would Daddy find a job where he didn't have to work all night? Raizo had learned to navigate these conversations with careful honesty, explaining that sometimes life changed in ways no one could control, but promising that their love for each other remained constant. Standing in the elevator with Maya and Lucas, Raizo thought about the parallel lives that brought people together in unexpected moments. These children, despite their expensive clothes and privileged circumstances, had the same need for safety and comfort that every child carried. Their mother, whoever she was probably fighting battles Raizo couldn't imagine, making sacrifices that left her children waiting alone in corporate buildings after midnight. The elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, revealing a corridor of glass-walled offices where a single light still burned. Through the transparent walls, Raizo could see a woman hunched over a desk, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that had probably looked professional 12 hours earlier but now seemed like an afterthought. She wore a navy suit that spoke of authority and success, but her posture suggested exhaustion that went deeper than a long workday. She looked up as they approached, and Raizo saw her face transform from confusion to recognition to overwhelming relief in the space of 3 seconds. This was Elena Vasquez, CEO of Meridian Technologies, the woman whose nameplate had dominated the building directory and whose photo graced the corporate literature scattered throughout the lobby. But in this moment, she wasn't a powerful executive. She was simply a mother who had lost track of time and found her children again. The story of how Elena had become the kind of mother who worked past midnight while her twins wandered the building would emerge later, in the conversations that followed their reunion. But as Raizo watched her gather Maya and Lucas into her arms, holding them with a desperation that spoke of deeper fears than one evening's crisis. He recognized something familiar in her expression. It was the look of someone trying to balance survival with love, someone making impossible choices because the alternative was worse. Elena's foundation had been built on different ground than Raizo's, but it had been just as thoroughly shattered by circumstances beyond her control. As she thanked him with tears streaming down her face, Raizo sensed that this midnight encounter was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Two broken people, connected by children who had brought them together when they least expected hope to find them again. Elena's hands trembled as she signed the check, her usually precise handwriting shaky from exhaustion and relief. She'd insisted on paying Raizo for the overtime hours he'd lose by staying late to help find her children, but the money felt inadequate for what he'd actually done. How do you compensate someone for seeing your children as human beings worthy of care rather than problems to be solved? This really isn't necessary, Raizo said quietly, folding the check without looking at the amount. Maya had fallen asleep against his shoulder while they waited for Elena to gather her things, and Lucas was holding onto his free hand with the trust children reserved for people who had proven themselves safe. Anyone would have done the same thing. Elena studied his weathered face, noting the careful way he supported Maya's weight, and the gentle tone he used even when speaking to adults. "No," she said with certainty that surprised them both. They really wouldn't have. That first night established a pattern neither of them acknowledged, but both began to expect. Elena started working later, but instead of leaving Maya and Lucas with the babysitter who charged extra for evening hours, she brought them to the office. They'd do homework in her conference room, eat dinner from the executive cafeteria, and wait for their mother to finish the endless cycle of meetings, calls, and crisis management that defined her days. Around 11, when the building grew quiet and most employees had gone home, they'd make their way down to find Raizo beginning his shift. What started as brief check-ins evolved into longer conversations. Raizo would take his break early to sit with the children, while Elena finished urgent calls, helping Lucas with math problems that frustrated him, and listening to Maya read aloud from whatever novel she'd discovered in the building's small library. Elena found herself timing her work to coincide with these moments, stealing glances through her office windows to watch a man she barely knew show her children the patience she struggled to maintain after 16-hour days. The first time Elena stayed past midnight specifically to talk with Raizo, she told herself it was about the children's schedules. Maya had mentioned that he had a son, and Elena wanted to understand how a single parent managed work and family obligations. But as they sat in her office, sharing coffee from the expensive machine her assistant maintained, their conversation drifted far from practical matters. Raizo told her about Danny's latest obsession with space exploration, how his 8-year-old son insisted they would build a rocket together someday and travel to Mars where they could start fresh without any sad memories. Elena found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, imagining this serious man constructing cardboard spaceships with his enthusiastic child. In return, she admitted that Maya had recently informed her that families should have dinner together every night, not just on weekends, and that Lucas had started saving his allowance to buy a house with a yard big enough for a dog. These late-night conversations became a refuge for both of them. Elena discovered that Raizo read voraciously, checking out books from the library on everything from philosophy to automotive repair. He'd educated himself on child psychology after Sophie's death, determined to help Danny process grief in healthy ways. His insights about parenting came from careful observation and genuine care, rather than expensive consultants and child development experts. Raizo learned that Elena's success had come at costs she was only beginning to understand. She'd inherited Meridian Technologies from her father Roberto, who'd built the company from a small software firm into a major defense contractor through sheer determination and 12-hour workdays. Roberto had raised Elena to be his successor, teaching her that business required sacrifice, and that emotional attachments were liabilities in boardroom negotiations. She'd learned to be brilliant, ruthless, and completely self-reliant, but no one had taught her how to be present for children who needed more than financial security. The night Elena told Raizo about her divorce, she'd been working on quarterly reports while Maya and Lucas slept on the office couch, covered by her spare blazer. Her ex-husband Marcus had been a fellow CEO who understood the demands of running a major corporation. But their marriage had been more merger than partnership. When the twins were born, they'd hired nannies, enrolled them in the best schools, and continued their 70-hour work weeks without missing a board meeting. The divorce had been inevitable, but still devastating. Marcus wanted full custody, arguing that Elena's work schedule made her an unfit mother, while she fought to maintain the relationship with her children that she'd never learned to prioritize. The custody agreement gave her weekends and holidays, but Maya and Lucas spent most nights in their father's suburban mansion with staff, who managed their routines with professional efficiency. "I see them 4 days a month," Elena had said, staring into her coffee cup. 4 days where I try to be the mother they deserve while running a company that employs 800 people. Marcus says I chose my career over my family, and maybe he's right. But if I don't fight for Meridian, I lose everything my father built, and my children lose their financial security." Raizo had listened without judgment, understanding better than most the impossible choices single parents faced. Sophie used to say that guilt was just love with nowhere to go. He'd offered quietly, "Maybe instead of carrying it around, we use it to make better choices going forward." Their friendship deepened through small kindnesses that spoke louder than grand gestures. Elena began bringing dinner for all of them, ordering from restaurants that delivered to office buildings and learning that Raizo preferred simple foods over the elaborate meals she'd grown accustomed to. She discovered he'd never tasted real sushi and made it her mission to expand his culinary horizons, while he taught her to appreciate the satisfaction of a perfectly grilled cheese sandwich made with patience and attention. Raizo started arriving earlier for his shifts, timing his arrival to coincide with the twins' dinner hour. He'd help with homework that challenged even Elena's MBA education, explaining long division to Lucas with the same methodical approach he'd once used for engineering calculations. He showed Maya how to organize her creative writing assignments, helping her structure stories with beginning, middle, and end, while encouraging the imagination that reminded him of Danny's endless questions about how things worked. The evening Elena brought Danny to the office marked a turning point neither of them expected. She'd offered to watch him when Raizo's regular babysitter canceled, insisting it was no trouble since Maya and Lucas were already there. Danny arrived clutching a worn backpack full of library books and a homemade sandwich that Raizo had prepared with obvious care. Elena watched her twins interact with this boy who wore second-hand clothes but carried himself with quiet confidence. Danny shared his books without being asked, helped Lucas with a puzzle that had frustrated him all week, and listened to Maya's stories with the same respectful attention his father showed everyone he met. Within an hour, the 3 children were collaborating on an elaborate fort built from office furniture and Elena's spare blazers, their laughter echoing through corridors designed for serious business. "He's wonderful," Elena told Raizo as they watched the children play. "You're raising an incredible kid." "Sophie deserves most of the credit," Raizo replied, but Elena could see the pride in his expression. She always said children learn more from what they observe than what they're told. Danny sees how we treat people, how we handle problems, whether we keep our promises. I try to remember that every decision I make is teaching him something about how to be in the world. Elena thought about her own children, brilliant and well-behaved, but lacking the easy confidence Danny displayed. Maya and Lucas had been raised by professionals who scheduled their activities and monitored their development. But they'd rarely seen adults solve problems through kindness rather than authority. Watching them with Danny and Raizo, she realized how much of childhood she'd outsourced to others, because she'd never learned to trust her own parenting instincts. The night that changed everything began like countless others. Elena was reviewing contracts while the children worked on a science project about renewable energy, their 3 heads bent over laptop screens as they researched solar panel efficiency. Raizo was explaining photovoltaic cells with the same patience he'd shown for every question they'd asked over the past months. Elena's phone rang with the news that Marcus wanted to modify their custody arrangement. He'd met someone new, a woman who didn't work outside the home and could provide the stable environment children needed. His lawyer was filing paperwork that would reduce Elena's time with Maya and Lucas to supervised visits twice a month. The phone call lasted 20 minutes, but when Elena emerged from her office, she found Raizo sitting with all 3 children as they finished their project. Danny was showing the twins how to make a simple battery from household items, his explanation clear and enthusiastic as he demonstrated each step. Maya and Lucas were completely absorbed, asking questions and taking careful notes like the serious students they'd been trained to be. "Everything okay?" Raizo asked, reading the tension in Elena's expression. Elena looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw something she'd been too busy to notice before. They were happy here. Not the careful happiness of children performing for adults, but the genuine contentment of kids who felt safe and valued. They'd found something in these late-night office hours that their expensive schools and structured activities hadn't provided. The simple pleasure of being seen and heard by adults who cared about their thoughts rather than their achievements. "Marcus wants to change our custody agreement," Elena said quietly, aware that small ears were listening even when focused on science projects. "He thinks I'm not providing a stable environment." Raizo didn't respond immediately, but Elena saw him glance at Maya and Lucas with protective concern. These children had become important to him too, she realized. Their late-night conversations, homework help, and shared dinners had created something none of them had expected. A makeshift family that functioned better than either of their original arrangements. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. Elena watched her daughter explain battery circuits to Danny with patient enthusiasm, saw her son's face light up when Raizo praised his problem-solving skills, and made a decision that would have terrified her months earlier. "I'm going to fight," she said, "but not the way I used to fight. I'm going to show them what stability actually looks like." The growing bond between them had started with shared concern for lost children, but it had evolved into something deeper and more complex. Two people who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control had found healing in the simple act of caring for each other's children, creating connections that transcended the professional boundaries that had initially brought them together. Neither Elena nor Raizo had been looking for love, but they'd discovered something equally valuable: the possibility of building a family from kindness, patience, and the willingness to put children's needs before adult fears. The custody hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9, and Elena had been awake since 3, pacing her penthouse apartment while reviewing her lawyer's notes. Marcus's legal team had built their case methodically, documenting every late night at the office, every missed school event, every time the twins had stayed past their bedtime in corporate conference rooms. They painted a picture of a mother so consumed by business that she'd forgotten her primary responsibility to her children. What they couldn't document, what no legal brief could capture, was the transformation that had occurred over the past 4 months. Elena had started leaving work at reasonable hours, arranging her schedule around Maya and Lucas's needs, rather than treating them as afterthoughts to her professional obligations. She'd learned to cook simple meals they actually wanted to eat, helped with homework without turning it into a performance review, and discovered that bedtime stories were more important than late-night conference calls with overseas clients. But none of that mattered if she couldn't prove it in court. And Marcus held every advantage. His new fiancée Jennifer was a former teacher who devoted herself to creating the perfect domestic environment, complete with scheduled activities, nutritious meals, and consistent bedtime routines. Their suburban home had everything child development experts recommended: designated study spaces, a backyard playground, and neighbors who knew each other's names. Elena's penthouse apartment, despite its luxury, felt sterile by comparison. She'd redecorated the children's rooms in bright colors they'd chosen themselves, installed a reading nook by the windows where Maya could curl up with her books, and cleared space in the living room for Lucas's increasingly complex Lego constructions. But it was still a downtown apartment, 20 floors above the street, isolated from the kind of community life Marcus could provide. The morning of the hearing, Elena found herself standing outside Raizo's apartment at 7:30, clutching coffee for both of them and fighting the urge to flee to her car. She'd been preparing for this battle alone, the way she'd faced every major challenge since her father's death, but something about seeing Danny's bicycle chained to the stair railing and hearing children's voices through the thin walls made her realize how much she'd been pretending to be stronger than she felt. Raizo answered the door in work clothes, his overnight shift at Meridian Tower finally complete, and Elena saw the exhaustion in his eyes that matched her own. Danny was at the kitchen table eating cereal and working on math homework with the determined focus he brought to everything, while Raizo made lunch for his son's school day with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. "I thought you might want company before court," Elena said, suddenly uncertain about the impulse that had brought her here. "But if this is a bad time—" "It's never a bad time," Raizo said simply, stepping aside to let her in. "Danny, Miss Elena brought coffee. Can you say good morning?" Danny looked up from his homework and gave her a smile that reminded Elena painfully of his father's quiet warmth. "Are you nervous about your meeting today?" he asked with the direct curiosity children possessed before learning that some questions were too personal to voice. Elena sat down across from him, accepting the normalcy of kitchen table conversations that had become precious to her over recent months. "Yes, I am nervous. It's a very important meeting about where Maya and Lucas will live. Will they still come to the office to do homework with us?" Danny asked, and Elena's chest tightened at the casual way he included himself in their makeshift family arrangements. "I don't know," Elena answered honestly. "I hope so, but that's what the meeting is about." Raizo handed her coffee in a mug that didn't match any others in his cabinet, the kind of mismatched collection that spoke of functional choices rather than design decisions. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the third chair with his own cup. Elena thought about giving the confident answer she'd been practicing, the one that projected certainty about positive outcomes and legal strategies. Instead, she found herself saying, quote, "Terrified. Marcus has everything a judge would want to see: stability, resources, a stay-at-home partner who can provide constant supervision. All I have is love and good intentions, and the legal system doesn't really know how to measure those things." "You have more than that," Raizo said quietly. "You have children who light up when they see you, who trust you enough to fall asleep in your office when they feel safe. You have 4 months of proving that priorities can change, that people can grow." The drive to the courthouse felt endless despite taking only 20 minutes. Elena's lawyer met her in the parking lot, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in custody cases, and had warned Elena from the beginning that emotional arguments rarely won against practical evidence. Patricia reviewed their strategy one final time. Focus on Elena's improved work-life balance, emphasize the children's attachment to their mother, and hope the judge valued stability over perfection. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat with his legal team and Jennifer, who wore a conservative dress and the kind of serene expression that suggested complete confidence in the outcome. She looked like every judge's ideal of maternal stability, while Elena felt exposed in her business suit, despite Patricia's assurance that professional competence was an asset rather than a liability. The proceedings began with Marcus's lawyer presenting their case with devastating efficiency. School records showing Elena's absence from parent-teacher conferences, medical appointments she'd missed due to work emergencies, testimony from teachers who'd interacted primarily with nannies rather than parents, a social worker's report noting that children thrived with consistent routines rather than the irregular schedules demanded by corporate leadership. Elena listened to her parenting reduced to a series of failures and felt something inside her breaking. Not her resolve to fight for her children, but her belief that love could overcome systemic disadvantages. Marcus had built his case on objective facts, while she was relying on subjective improvements that couldn't be quantified in legal documents. When Patricia called Elena to testify on her own behalf, she felt the weight of every mistake highlighted by opposing counsel. Yes, she'd missed school events. Yes, she'd relied heavily on childcare providers. Yes, her work schedule had been unpredictable and demanding. But how did you explain to a judge that learning to make grilled cheese sandwiches with patience rather than efficiency had been revolutionary? How did you prove that reading bedtime stories was more valuable than attending every PTA meeting? "Mrs. Vasquez," Patricia said, "can you tell the court about any changes you've made in your parenting approach over the past several months?" Elena looked at the judge, a middle-aged woman whose expression revealed nothing about her thoughts on the testimony she'd heard. "I learned that being a good provider isn't the same as being a good parent," Elena said. "I thought giving my children every material advantage would compensate for my absence. But I was wrong. Children need presence more than presence." Marcus's lawyer objected to the emotional nature of the statement, but the judge allowed Elena to continue. She talked about homework sessions that had taught her more about her children's minds than any school report, about discovering that Maya wrote poetry in private notebooks, and Lucas had inherited his grandfather's gift for mechanical puzzles, about realizing that bedtime routines were sacred rituals that created security in children's minds rather than inconvenient delays to adult productivity. "Your Honor," Elena said, abandoning her prepared remarks, "I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't promise I'll never miss another school event, or that work will never demand difficult choices. But I can promise that my children will always know they come first, that their needs matter more than any business crisis, and that loving them is the most important job I'll ever have." The judge called a recess, and Elena sat in the hallway feeling like she'd failed to make the case that mattered most. Patricia tried to reassure her, but they both knew that emotional appeals rarely trumped practical evidence in family court. Marcus's team looked confident, already discussing logistics for the custody transfer that seemed inevitable. Elena was checking her phone for messages when she saw Raizo walking down the courthouse corridor, Danny beside him and Maya, and Lucas running ahead, despite the formal setting. Her heart stopped as she realized what was happening. Raizo was bringing the children to testify, risking his job and Danny's school day to support her fight for custody. "What are you doing here?" Elena asked, gathering her twins into her arms while trying to understand how Raizo had managed to get them from their school. "Your kids called my dad," Danny explained matter-of-factly. "They said you needed help, so we came to help." Elena looked at Raizo, seeing the determination in his expression that she'd witnessed the night he'd chosen to help lost children instead of protecting his own interests. "You could lose your job for this," she said quietly. "Some things are worth the risk," Raizo replied, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the realization that she wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The judge reconvened court to find Maya and Lucas sitting in the front row, their small hands folded in their laps and their faces serious with the weight of their purpose. Elena's lawyer requested permission for the children to speak, and despite Marcus's objections, the judge agreed to hear what they wanted to say. Maya stood first, her 7-year-old voice clear and steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we want to stay with our mom. She works hard because she wants to take care of us, but she's learning to have dinner with us and help with homework. She reads us stories and lets us ask questions about everything." Lucas nodded vigorously. "And she doesn't get mad when we spill things or forget to put our clothes away. She just helps us clean up and remember better next time." The judge's expression softened slightly as she listened to children advocating for their mother with the simple honesty that cut through legal complexities. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that despite all her fears about failing as a parent, her children felt loved and valued enough to fight for their relationship with her. But it was the letter Maya pulled from her pocket that changed everything. "Mr. Raizo helped us write this," she said, handing a folded paper to the bailiff. "It's from our mom, but not the one who's here today. We found it in her desk at home." Elena's breath caught as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope, writing that belonged to the woman who'd given birth to Maya and Lucas, but had died when they were only 3 years old. Jennifer, Marcus's first wife, who'd been Elena's friend before becoming her predecessor in an arrangement that had never made complete sense until this moment. The judge read the letter silently, her professional composure slipping slightly as she processed words written by a dying woman to guide decisions about her children's future. When she finished reading, she looked at Elena with something approaching compassion rather than judicial neutrality. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning," the judge announced. "I need time to consider all the testimony and evidence presented today." As people filed out of the courtroom, Elena remained frozen in her seat, staring at the letter that Maya had somehow found and chosen to share at the moment when everything seemed lost. Raizo sat beside her, Danny on his lap, and the twins pressed against Elena's sides, all of them waiting for her to process what had just happened. Whatever Jennifer's letter contained, whatever final wisdom she'd left for decisions about her children's welfare, Elena knew that this moment had revealed something more important than any legal document. Her children loved her enough to fight for her, and Raizo cared enough to risk everything to help them do it. The test they'd all been facing wasn't really about custody arrangements or legal arguments. It was about whether love could create family bonds strong enough to withstand the forces that tried to tear them apart. The letter from Jennifer had been tucked inside an old photo album for nearly 3 years, written during her final weeks as cancer consumed her body but left her mind devastatingly clear about what mattered most. Maya had discovered it while searching for pictures for a school project about family trees, recognizing her birth mother's handwriting from birthday cards they'd saved in memory boxes. Jennifer's words were simple but profound, written to whoever might need guidance about her children's future. She'd observed Marcus's tendency to prioritize control over connection, his belief that structure could substitute for emotional presence. Most importantly, she'd written about Elena, the woman who'd become Marcus's second wife not for love but for practical partnership. and how she'd watched Elena struggle to find her place in a ready-made family. "Elena has the capacity to love my children the way they deserve," Jennifer had written. "She just needs permission to trust her instincts over everyone else's expectations." Maya and Lucas need a mother who sees them as individuals, not reflections of her success or failure. They need someone who will fight for them when it matters, even if she makes mistakes along the way. The judge's decision came at 9:30 the following morning. Elena would retain primary custody, with Marcus receiving expanded visitation rights but losing his bid for full control. More significantly, the court acknowledged that children's emotional bonds shouldn't be severed by legal technicalities, especially when those bonds contributed to their well-being and development. Outside the courthouse, Marcus approached Elena with an expression she'd never seen before, something between regret and genuine concern. "Jennifer was right about you," he said quietly. "I was so focused on winning that I forgot what was best for them. They need you, Elena. They always have." 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of a modest house in Highland, watching Raizo teach Danny and Lucas how to change a bicycle tire, while Maya helped her prepare Sunday dinner. The house wasn't as grand as her penthouse or as suburban as Marcus's estate, but it felt like home in ways those other places never had. Elena had restructured her role at Meridian Technologies, promoting trusted executives to handle daily operations while she focused on strategic decisions that didn't require 16-hour days. The company thrived under distributed leadership, proving that her father's belief in personal sacrifice as business necessity had been more myth than requirement. Raizo had returned to engineering, hired by Elena's company to head their new renewable energy division. His nights were now spent at home helping 3 children with homework, reading bedtime stories, and building the kind of family routines that created security rather than stress. Danny had gained siblings who adored him, while Maya and Lucas discovered what it meant to have a father figure who listened to their problems without trying to fix them immediately. The wedding had been small, held in their backyard with only close friends and family present. Danny had walked Elena down the aisle while Maya and Lucas stood beside Raizo, all 3 children grinning with the satisfaction of architects whose careful construction had finally reached completion. Elena wore a simple dress instead of an elaborate gown, and Raizo's vows included promises to Maya and Lucas about being the father they deserved. During the reception, as they watched their children play with other kids who didn't see anything unusual about blended families and second chances, Elena thought about the letter she'd written to Jennifer and left at her grave. A thank you note for the wisdom to see what mattered most, and a promise to love her children with the fierce protectiveness Jennifer had recognized Elena possessed, but had never learned to trust. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that night?" Raizo asked, settling beside Elena on their porch swing while 3 exhausted children sprawled in the living room watching a movie they'd seen dozens of times. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways their lives could have continued on separate tracks of quiet desperation and missed connections. "I think we would have found each other eventually," she said finally. "People who are meant to be family have a way of recognizing each other, even when they're not looking." Above them, the first stars appeared in the clear Colorado sky, and Elena felt the contentment that came from building something lasting with someone who understood that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other repeatedly, especially when circumstances made that choice difficult. They'd created exactly what Jennifer had hoped for, what the children had needed, and what neither adult had believed possible until they'd learned to trust that families could be built from kindness, patience, and the courage to help strangers who turned out not to be strangers at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.